Jesper Juul is the author of 3 books on video games, starting with Half Real back in 2005, followed by A Casual Revolution in 2010, and most recently The Art of Failure in 2013. He's currently a visiting assistant professor at the New York University Game Center, and he joins me now to talk about all of the above. Hello.
Hi, how are you?
Good. In The Art of Failure, you remark that failure in games tells us that we are flawed and deficient, and as such, video games are the art of failure, the singular art form that sets us up for failure and allows us to experience and experiment with failure. And that really reminded me of Paolo Pedersini's Flash game, Every Day the Same Dream.
Yeah.
Have you played that?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so for those that haven't, you play a character that repeatedly goes through a rather mundane daily routine. You wake up, you dress, you commute to work, you sit at a cubicle, and then you repeat. But in a way, the fun and interesting aspects don't start until you fail the game by choosing not to conform to that routine. And I just wondered how a game like that looks through the lens of the art of failure.
Well, so obviously it's one that kind of plays with our expectations for failure. So another less serious example is in Knit Stories. There's this game this level called Don't Eat the Mushroom, where if you don't eat the mushroom, basically nothing happens. You complete the game, and everything interesting happens if you do eat the mushroom, which you're not supposed to. So I do think that there's like a few different aspects to it. One is that there might be like the overt signaling from the game that this is what you're supposed to do, and this is the goal that you can fail against. And then say in Every Day the Same Dream, obviously in a way that's kind of a parody of traditional game design, and the kind of, you could say, the traditionalness of the whole kind of setting and graphical style goes hand in hand with that. And the kind of reveal is one that kind of is supposed to make you question both games and we like the kind of setting, the kind of dreary drab life. But I do think that actually might be a slightly different question than the question of what kind of feels really, what might feel bad or unpleasant for you as a player, because I think that's fundamentally mostly defined by what you are personally trying to achieve, right? So say, even though you can say like Every Day the Same Dream appears to be about like conforming to this, and then obviously in a way the kind of intended success criteria of the game is really to be doing what at first seems like failing, but that is actually turns out to be actually a success in a sense.
Mm-hmm.
But then of course as a player, then if you knew that, then you actually in a way like failed to fail, you would actually still be failing, right? Because you'd be failing against whatever you're personally trying to achieve. And so that goes for any kind of counter playing that you might do in any game. That I think the emotionally important thing is always the kind of goal that you've actually been setting for yourself, rather than the official goal. And then of course, like perhaps most of the time, I do think we kind of are trying to follow the official goal, but when we're not, it's the really important thing is certainly like what we're personally trying to achieve.
Yeah, it's interesting in that game that one of the things that you can achieve is to just throw yourself off the building that you work at as a sort of act of rebellion against it. So that's like embracing that sense of failure, but you're also succeeding because you're not conforming in a certain respect.
Yeah.
Following your argument in Casual Revolution, it seems like learning to play any game is sort of intrinsically good. And I definitely sympathize with that position, because games have often suffered from the stigma that it's not a real element in our culture, and it's often dismissed. But the cynic in me looks at the number of hours that we've logged into Farmville and Angry Birds, and I'm wondering if there's a distinction to be made, between, say, teaching someone to read and teaching someone the value of challenging themselves through what they choose to read.
Yeah, I mean, so games are the meta category, right? So it is, when I say it's about learning, it's obviously, when I say it's about failure, it obviously also implies that it's about learning, as many people, such as Jesper Juul has argued. Again, I think it's kind of hard to make the entirely general case. So you see, I'm always like kind of it's one of those things, right? So I do think I sort of personally have an experience of games being kind of deeply meaningful that in a way it's almost always interesting to learn to play a new game and to improve. There's always something that's kind of fundamentally satisfying about that. And on the other hand, I'm also skeptical about in a way like making that in a kind of too broad or too kind of self-assured argument, right? That in a way it's kind of very easy to make this claim that obviously games are art, games are good for us, games lead to kind of profound, just kind of profound insights and profound self-insights, and it prepares to do well at work and in school and so on. But in a way, I think that the problem is it's very easy to make this argument, and I do think in a way it's also kind of too easy. And then in a way, it wouldn't even if you actually did a study and then like proved beyond all reasonable doubt that clearly, if you just like make the kids play Halo or I don't know, every day the same dream, then this improves their like reading scores by 3% averaged over 5 years. Right, in a way that even that actually wouldn't be very enjoyable, right? Because then games would certainly lose some of that like for their own sake, like game for game's sake, element that they have already. So I'm worried. I'm in a way that it's kind of tempting to make these kind of arguments how good games are for you, but I'm kind of skeptical. I'm very, very wary of doing that.
Okay. I guess as a follow-up to that, should we be more critical of games that sort of just tap into the desire to play, but that don't challenge us to question that desire?
Yeah, it's a good question. So certainly there's some kind of game that does it in a kind of interesting way. So I guess even though by now it's like almost an old controversial example, I do think like the BioShock, the first one does have something interesting about the kind of following orders element of games. Also, I guess I always waver between being a snob and being kind of inclusive on these terms. So I do like this idea that there's like a large variety of interesting experiences to be had, and in a way I don't want to be the kind of judge of what's good and bad, but then in other situations I do want to be a snob, right? And so for example, I'm not sure it's Farmville as much as it's role-playing games, if I want to be critical of a particular game genre. So like the whole idea of the resources gathering and the skills amassing in the character or characters that you're controlling, in a way it is a little weird, right? Because it's not you, it's the character, so it's a kind of external thing, and in a way that it feels like you're improving, but it might just be the character. And so I think that's probably the argument I'm most sympathetic to. And you say even Angry Birds is actually, well, in this case, it's much better than World of Warcraft as a game, because it's more fundamentally about learning. On the other hand, I do think I do enjoy a game like Mass Effect. There are certain kind of things you can get out of that, because in a way it's more of a kind of controlled experience, right? Even though it seems you're doing something very unique, leveling up your character, it's also something that is sort of guaranteed over time. So it's a particular way of structuring your experience, the whole leveling up. And so I was just saying that again similarly, I think I can. It's complicated. This kind of relation between what you like and what you can make an argument for, right? And I think, as I also discussed in the book, that there is a kind of certain temptation to have certain things that you personally like, and then construct some kind of theoretical argument for why that's the right thing and why everybody else is wrong. I think one should always be a little worried about doing that, but then I think the good news is that there usually tends to be some kind of hole in the argument that, in my experience, you always, like, regardless of what kind of argument you're trying to construct, you always end up spending some time playing something that doesn't fit the argument.
That's a great point.
So in a way, that's also part of what's interesting about theorizing about games is there is a kind of gap in a way between what you kind of intuitively seem to be picking up and then the kind of arguments you make around it. And there's always some kind of hole or gap between those two that kind of forces you to kind of keep thinking in a way.
Yeah, that's great, because I actually have a question here that kind of gets right at that. I find that there's a tendency in game scholarship to try to essentialize some aspect of video games. So for a number of years, scholars have been looking for like the quintessential element that makes a game a game. And so, is it the rules? Is it the narrative? Is it the player? And I found that the answer really depends on the sample of games being drawn from, to the point that it's difficult to separate a theory of games from the games played to develop that theory. So, given that the sometimes radical differences between the genres, can the term game itself really apply to all titles and still be a useful concept?
Yeah, so let's see. I think the term sort of like essentialism. I think in a way it's a kind of sound critical move, but it's also something that I think sometimes prevents us from kind of asking this certain questions. So, for example, like one question I was interested in was the question like, do the things that we call games have anything in common? And I do think the answer is by and large yes. But I think you can only actually ask that question if you're not afraid of getting a yes answer. Right? And so the idea of something like essentialism in a way is kind of such, oh no, you should always answer no. It's very important. And so worry about that being a kind of way of not answering certain questions that are actually pretty interesting. But of course, true, like games are also a pretty wide field. I do think that there's a reason why we tend to use something like the word game. And I do think that they have their certain kind of rule structures and kind of goal directedness that they have in common, and then a certain sense of what I call negotiable consequences. But it's also sort of somewhat tied to ideas of say like things being voluntary and things being in a way presented or understood as being not essential in a way, or not important.
Well, I think
as directly as say like eating or going to work is, and that is part of the experience. And then you just say that there are a lot of different experiences, and there are lots of different games that in a way build on this in different kinds of ways. And then you have more recent things like not games, which it's very clear that people are very conflicted about it, even people who defend them as games, because they say like a game like Proteus is also very clearly an attempt at making something that is different from the things we actually call games. And I know that the designers, for some reason, then have been felt very disturbing to hear people saying it's not a game, even though it's very clearly designed to be at least an not a game, and even though it kind of still wins lots of prizes in game festivals. So I think it's important to still be able to talk about whether things have something in common, or say like whether there's anything in particular we expect when something's labeled a game, or whether we design a game. And I think the answer to that is clearly yes. And of course, then at the same time, it's also something that evolves over time. So when SimCity came out, there was a big sense that it wasn't a game. And today, these days, I think people in general don't have a lot of issues with naming it a game. So clearly, the term game, especially video game, has kind of become broader during the last 20 years.